Welcome to the Well Prepared Life podcast, where we dive into the fundamentals of readiness for life's challenges, covering topics from personal responsibility to mental and physical preparedness and beyond. Let's forge resilience, nurture growth, and embrace responsibility on the journey to the well prepared life. Welcome to another episode of the Well Prepared Life podcast. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Kyle.
And on this podcast, we talk about forging resilience, nurturing growth, and embracing responsibility on the journey to the well-prepared life. And part of that process of forging resilience and nurturing growth is conflict. Kyle, do you like conflict?
Not really.
No.
Not a big fan.
It's a pretty normal response. I used to say that I liked conflict, but then if I was honest with myself, I'm like, no, I hate it.
Yeah.
Every time. Now, I used to actually be like, I'd not care about people very well, and so I'd kind of like be like excited. I'd be like, well, get him, like, go get him.
Yeah.
Like kind of coming back, we've talked about it briefly as far as like the type 8 challenger personality. Like I have that like natural drive,
Flex your muscles.
with that.
Yeah.
And thankfully, as I've grown and matured and softened in good ways, it's turned into I have to do that.
Yeah.
And it's like, it hurts that I have to do that, which is a different experience than let's go.
I've gone through the same phase of like, oh yeah, I kind of like approaching every situation is, where's the challenge, how can I improve something? Then I'm kind of more people pleasy, I guess, and just kind of don't really want to address this if I don't have to.
And so conflict is one of those things that honestly a lot of people want to avoid it. And typically, actually, if you don't have a slight feeling of like I'm uncomfortable about this. Mm-hmm. It's like there's kind of the two groups of people. There's the people who want to avoid it completely, and the people who are too eager to jump into it. And I was definitely in that second group for a while, but now I'm in the spot where it's like I'd rather avoid it, but it's like there's an internal drive in me that's like I have to deal with this.
Taking the responsibility on yourself.
Yep. And so as we talk about this, there are two kind of references. One particular we're going to sit in, but that's Patrick Lencioni. He has a lot of books on like team building and like business leadership. Mm-hmm. But he talks about conflict and how it deals with trust and results and all of these things. And I think he writes it in the context of businesses, but it applies, like the principles apply like globally. Like they're not just business only principles.
So like other like personal relationships, mm-hmm. marriages, family units.
The ideas of trust and conflict are not business things. Okay. They are people things.
Right.
Another person we're going to reference a little bit is, I actually forgot her name, but the book that she wrote is Radical Candor.
Okay.
I've
seen that.
And it's a pretty popular book. She was in a lot of high executive positions and basically talking about, so again, from a business perspective, but it applies personally as well, as far as like, are you willing to say the hard thing that is going to help somebody?
Okay.
And so the key thing before talking about conflict though, Lencioni has this pyramid, and I may throw up a graphic of this, but if I don't, just picture this pyramid. And on the bottom tier is you have trust. Trust is first.
Foundation.
The foundation of the pyramid is trust, mm-hmm. and then conflict. And then he talks about commitment, accountability, and results. And those are more things that we won't get into today, but we're going to sit on the trust and conflict because to have conflict, you have to have trust.
Right. So what happens when you don't have trust? What are some negative side effects of that?
Yeah, I mean, how do you feel with somebody, like when you're in how you have to accomplish somebody with something, you have to mm-hmm. accomplish something with somebody that you don't know at all. What, like you've never met them before and you're like, hey, mm-hmm. you and you pair up, figure this thing out. And it's like a harder
skepticism.
thing. Yeah.
What is it? Their stubbornness, I guess. They don't want
mm-hmm.
to do it just because someone else is telling them to do something.
Yeah.
But if they trust that the speaker has their best interests and kind of has a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, even maybe a better way of putting that is say you and somebody else that you have never met before, and you're told, hey, that guy is going to like give you instructions for how to complete this task. How would you feel?
Yeah. Like, why should I listen to that guy?
Yeah.
I was thinking conflict with a stranger. If you don't trust a stranger, your conflict is like, whoa, this is life or death situation right now. This is like, so a random stranger at a gas station. This is
so you have physical conflict.
Right.
So physical conflict is a thing.
Yeah.
But it's like, so you have this whole idea as far as like, if you don't know somebody, if you mm-hmm. don't trust them, conflict immediately becomes something where you're on guard.
Okay.
Like that's like the first thing. It's like you're on guard from the start.
Defensive.
With people that you don't trust.
That makes sense. I would agree with that.
And so So from that, like if you want to be able to actually step into healthy conflict, which we'll describe a little bit more later, it's like you have to trust somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, how would you define trust?
Trust, I'd say knowing that everyone's, well, in a team setting, knowing everyone's best interests are for the one single purpose or mission to get the results. If it's in a personal setting, I'd say like feeling secure, feeling safe, not that they're going to try to attack me or manipulate me.
Yeah.
I would say that.
Yeah. And I think those are good. And I would add to it as far as like people I can be real with.
Yeah.
As far as like for
Vulnerable.
taking, because like, so that's the team context, but I would say in the personal context, people that I know aren't going, like you said, like not manipulate. So like another way of putting that is like not take advantage of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
People who have my best interest in mind as well.
Someone who doesn't gossip.
Yeah.
Because if I can trust them with this information, I know that they're not going to tell somebody else.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like somebody that can keep a secret.
Right. Yeah. That's good.
And so that first question, as far as like defining trust, is important because like, what does it mean to be that? And I think the next step is then how do you build it? So it's like, sure, you define it. It's somebody you feel safe with, somebody that you feel like connected with, somebody that you know is your best interest in mind, somebody that you trust. Well, it's like, how do you actually get there with somebody? And we've talked about these kind of things a little bit as we talked about building community and what that looks like and just different aspects of that. But there are like the basic foundational principle for building trust is getting to know someone.
Yeah.
As far as like getting to know them better and better and better and better.
Right. Like the first example, two strangers meeting each other, if you're not going to have any trust. But the more you know, the more trust you build. Is it necessarily that way, or do you have to build?
Well, kind of like we said before, as far as like you shoot little bullets.
Yeah.
With the idea of like trust, like seeing what you can trust people with.
That's true.
And so that's like you seeing what you can trust people with, but also it's like learning about them, their life story, the things that they've gone through. And that's especially in like a personal environment. In a team environment, it can be more like, are you good at what you say you're good at? Are you, what's your background on this like job? Like, do you have experience in this? Are you somebody that like knows what they're talking about in this realm?
Yeah.
But like for personal stuff, is it like, oh, you know what it feels like to go through something hard, that I went through something similar.
Okay.
Like one of the examples,
been there a couple steps ahead of you,
even or just as far as like them being willing to be vulnerable with you.
Oh, okay.
And you know you can be vulnerable back.
They've given you bullets, and then now you can give some back to them. Yeah.
And like one example of this that Lencioni does talk about in a team environment that's still like just the knowing people side, even with a team, is he gives this like exercise of like, everybody go around the room and share one like thing, like basically obstacle or hardship that you overcame as a child. And it's basically like
interesting
ways that people like tell a story about their life that shape somewhat of how they think. And like today, and where it's like, it could be like, oh, I didn't know you had that kind of thing happen in your childhood.
Yeah.
Like I know of somebody in my life where it's like, you would never know looking at him, but like he basically like left his home with his parents at like 17. And like was homeless for like a couple years before he like got married and figured out life, and it's like working now, but like he's had a hard life.
Yeah.
And it's like he doesn't present that way. He's just a resilient guy who just like is faithful and consistent and reliable. But it's like you hear small parts of his story and you're like, oh, that's maybe why you like more are like slow to build trust and slow to like let people in. Kind of thing is like, or why you want to own the things and take charge and like hold on to stuff yourself.
So you're saying that knowing someone's background, kind of knowing them, kind of helps you be able to navigate conversations, navigate the conflict.
Yeah, it helps you to understand how they click, how they tick.
Okay, how they tick. Yeah. Okay. What makes them tick? Yeah. Okay.
And because it's that idea as far as like, if you know how somebody thinks and how they work, it's a lot easier to like understand when they respond in a certain way or they react in a different way. Okay. And so that's how you can grow in trust, is by like leaning into those types of things and sharing hard things with each other.
What about the, I heard in a concept, was it Steve Covey, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People?
Actually just started reading that.
Yeah?
I'm impressed.
Like, have you read it before?
I thought I did, but then I'm like reading it and I'm like, oh, I don't recognize any of this. So I'm going in and I'm like, oh, this is really good. I'm glad I'm
pretty
reading
cool.
Yeah. Have you read it?
Yeah, I listened to it.
Okay.
So I want to get the book to read through it physically and take notes on it.
But anyway, so Covey, what did he say?
One point he was talking about deposits and withdrawals.
Mm-hmm.
So like his son, if he's trying to ask him to do chores or help out with like, tasks around the house, if he only does that with him, his son's going to be, bitter and upset. But if he makes deposits, and it could be seen as transactional, but it's really just being mindful of how many times have I asked for favors from this person versus do I actually care about this person? So it's kind of been something I've been trying to be mindful of coworkers and family members, and trying to be, okay, how can I pour into them and give them like care and love and not just say, hey, can you help me do this? Or let's do that.
No, I think that's really good because it is like so, like I know that I if I don't check myself, I fall into a rhythm of only connecting with people when I have an ask.
Yeah. Right.
And that leads to people feeling used.
And I don't know how it connects to trust, but I feel like there's something there of just not feeling.
Well, it's like if you exist for my benefit, like I don't have your best interest in mind.
Okay.
And if I only reach out to people when I need something from them, then I'm communicating, you exist for me.
Yeah.
Like in my life, you're here because it helps me.
Very self-centered, very selfish mindset. Okay.
And that's something I've had to like work on.
Yeah.
And I'm still not great at it, but it's something I've had to be like conscious of and actively do, because it's like I don't text people just casually very much at all.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have text conversations almost ever.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think of like my family, like my parents, they're like, oh, we want to talk more. I'm like, well, I don't text anybody and you aren't close to me. So it's like, okay. And we try to set up phone calls, but I'm not great at that.
Yeah.
And then I've gotten better about it over the years. But when I was first married and like living apart from them, there's definitely times where I would like look back and be like, I've called you maybe once a month for the past 6 months, and it's always been because I had something that I needed from you. And it's like, oh, that's not being a good son.
Right.
That is just wanting to use my parents.
Yeah.
But that applies to like anybody as far as how you interact with like being in a church. And here's the thing that's interesting. So I work with a lot of volunteers. But one of the things I've read in a couple different places now is this thought process of like, you should treat your employees like you would treat a volunteer, in the sense that like, sure, you pay them, you can expect more of them, but as far as you want them to be there and you want them to want to be there and you want them to want to contribute like fully and engage, like you don't want them to be reluctant in doing their job.
Yeah. Right.
It's like sometimes that may be the case, like, hey, I just need to like suck it up and get this done. But that's not where you want them to live, is in that spot of like just constantly like being like, it's your job, just do it. It's your job, just do it.
There's something, I think Simon Sinek said something about that. It's like the team works better whenever everybody is invested and really wants to give their all. I mean, it's natural.
And so like me working in church, primarily work with volunteers. Like I lead volunteers. But it's like one of the things that's said often is make sure you have like times when you like hang out with your volunteers when there is no ask.
Yeah. Not expecting anything from them. Just,
it's like get lunch with them just to catch up.
Yeah.
And don't ask anything from them. And do that on purpose often, because you want to pour into them, not just make, like you said, withdrawals. It's that same concept.
Yeah, that's good.
So that idea of building trust then leads to, so say you have the foundation of trust, well, then you get into like the idea of like actually like, okay, I trust you and this hard topic has come up and we need to talk about it.
Okay.
And that's conflict.
Yes. Okay. Hard topics. Okay. Talking about hard conversations.
Yeah. Hard conversations.
Okay.
Any hard conversation, any conversation you come into, you're like, I wish I didn't have to talk about this. That's a form of conflict.
Okay. Even if it's just a casual conversation with someone else?
I would say, yeah. Like as far as like, and it's just different degrees of things. Like people disagreeing on what like football team is the best and which player is best. Like that's technically
food
conflict.
Preferences and
when you argue about something, even if it's a silly thing, that's a form of conflict. But I think that is actually a great example. Can we say that of like they're talking about an issue that is not related to the relationship. In the sense that like you can argue about who your favorite like football player is and who's the best at this position or whatever. Like you can have that argument, but you know that even if you disagree, that doesn't change your standing with that other person. Like that's a pretty easy thing to say.
Okay.
And I would say it's unhealthy. Like you hear about the like different fans who are like, oh, you don't like my team, I hate you. Yeah. Like that's the unhealthy side of this. But then if you apply that idea of like you have an issue, the best player at this position, so you have that as the issue. Well, what if the issue is something that is closer to home? I'm trying to think of a good example.
like how to do the dishes
Yeah.
between,
Mm-hmm.
married couple.
Yeah. Like my wife has talked to me and she's like, Nathan, you have a thing that happens when you set down trash on the counter, it disappears. And she's like,
she is the one who.
She's like, I call it kitchen trash.
Yeah.
And if you set it down and it doesn't go to the trash can, I'm the one throwing it away later because you forget that it exists.
It's a magical counter. That's
and she can say that to me, and I'm not like distraught or devastated because I'm like, I know she has my best in mind, and I'm like, well, if I want to like love and care for her well, then I need to like help keep things clean.
Right. Because you don't want to inconvenience and burden her because you love her. She's your wife.
And so it's like I have her best in mind, she has mine, and so what that means is she can bring up that thing that she doesn't like, that's an issue that we both interact with regularly, and I can then be like, oh, I can change, I can work on that. I don't need to be like, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Like, you'll be fine. You can just throw it away. It'll be fine.
Right. Yeah. Just suck it up. So what happens? So what's the defining factor to bring it up, I guess, is because sometimes I feel like you could just swallow it. You could just put up with it.
Yeah.
Something that bothers you, or you could just not, and then you can have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so like, when should you enter into conflict?
Yeah.
This kind of thing.
Yeah. When should you bring something up?
Yeah. And I think, so there's some subjectiveness to this, from like people who believe, like, who are believers in Jesus. It's like, there's a prayer aspect to that too sometimes.
Okay. Yeah.
Of like, when do I, like, I've used the term, I think I've used it on this podcast, but I definitely use it in other places. When do I need to die to myself versus when do I need to say something?
Yeah.
And I would say, like, not to over spiritualize it in any way, but there's an element as far as like, is this thing significant or insignificant? So that's the first thing, as far as like ranking it on like, if it's a big thing, probably need to talk about it.
Okay.
But if it's like I'm trying to think, like, I think I've definitely talked about you with this, like talked to you about this, but like we had a bathroom at our first place that we lived when we were married, and like Tara would like get her hands wet and then go to the soap, and it was like in a place where it like got soap everywhere, like, or got water everywhere.
Yeah.
And I was like, can you not
Yeah.
do that anymore? Like, kind of thing.
Right.
And like looking back, I'm like, that's very petty.
Right.
And very small.
A couple drops of water.
And I should have just been like, you know what? It's okay. I don't need to worry about this, and like moved on.
Right.
But
she
I was
changed how she did
immature.
it.
I was less mature than I was now. And
Yeah.
I was in a spot of like, I have to say something. This is me at the time of life when I was like, I have to.
Yeah.
I need to get, like, say something. If it bothers me, I need to say something.
Yeah.
So there's a spot to prayerfully consider. It's like, is this a big enough issue to actually address? But then on the flip side of that, kind of one of those things that can help you understand if it's a bigger issue is like, is it something where you're like building resentment over it towards your spouse or your friend or whoever this is that you're like you feeling this about? Like,
Yeah.
when this thing happens, do you get more and more angry every time, and you think about every other time that it's happened?
And I think that's probably one time to bring it up, right?
Yeah.
Is when you're starting to notice you're getting
And
bitter
it's like,
and angry.
I would say, like, if you recognize that, like, I'm probably not going to be able to let this go,
Yeah.
like, and I'm going to think about this every time it happens, that's when you need to bring it up.
Yeah.
Hopefully before you get to the spot where you've built up bitterness and anger about it.
Right. Because yeah, if you let it go on too long, it's definitely harder and comes out way more loaded emotions.
But yeah, so like one of the questions I was going to ask is like, what happens when you avoid conflict? That's one of the big things.
Yeah.
Is resentment.
Anger just builds up.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like you don't even want to be around that person.
Yeah.
If you haven't had the conversation.
Like, have you ever had situations in your life where you're like, I should talk about this, but not?
Oh yeah. I mean, one example was I can talk about it because it's something small, is hangers. My wife likes all the hangers to be the same color. And I was upset because she threw away hangers that were perfectly good, just recycled hangers that were perfectly good, but then bought hangers. And I didn't bring it up. I was like, you know what? That's something small. It's like $5 we spent on hangers. I can deal with it. You know, I just suck it up. But then we had another discussion, and then I brought it up like an idiot. And I was like, you wasted money on hangers. And yeah, so that was not good because it was still eating at me. I just didn't fully address it. Probably I just squashed it down like the idiot I was.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's like, it was something that like ate at you enough to bring it up another time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Because that's the other side of things. If you make the decision, you're like, you know what? I'm going to die to myself and I'm not going to bring this up. Like, you have to not bring it up.
Right.
Like, you have to be honest
can't
with yourself.
bring it up.
Like, if you're going to say, hey, I'm I'm not going to let this be an issue that I like have to like bring up and like enter into conflict for. You have to genuinely let it go.
Would you say that's a little bit of self-awareness? You need to be aware when you would bring it up?
I think so.
I think there's a lot of times I'm like, I won't bring it up. And then I know deep down, this is going to come back up later.
Yeah.
So
I think so.
Bring it
There's definitely a self-awareness aspect there where it's like, you gotta be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
Like if it's not something that you're going to let go, you can't just say, well, I'm just going to let this go.
Yeah.
But then not. Like as far as like, and there might be some, like I think of a story from the founding pastor here. And there's a story he told with him and his wife. And he likes to have things super orderly, super neat. And he was constantly trying to like clean up the top of her dresser. And like, cause I was just one area where, and she just wasn't that way. She's like, I like things to be relatively clean, but doesn't need to be like everything in its perfect place all the time. And so there was one day when they were cleaning up their room, they were working on stuff. He had cleaned up most of the restroom, and then he walked over to her. She's at her dresser. He's like, how can I help you with this? And he said, and she was like, you can't. Like, you need to let it go.
Yeah.
And that was a moment for him where he says, he's like, sometimes you need to make the choice to let it go. And it's an active choice. And it's not just a, will I not think about this anymore? But it's like, will I die to myself in this moment? And that's like a dresser is a small example. But I think it's a important concept to like I think of it more from the flip side of like where I'm bad at this, where it's like recognizing I'm mad at something and I needed to kind of like die to my feelings about like, well, I'm just not good at that, so I'm not going to do it. It's like, no, I need to do it.
So that's interesting. So would you say that times where you could get away with not bringing something up is if it's selfish, like self-centered, where you realize your preference is getting in the way of the issue? Because we're talking about conflict being the issue is the focus. We got to work together to resolve an issue. So when it's not focused on the issue, when you're focused on yourself and like what you want out of the other person, that's when you should, all right, I'm not going to bring it up.
Yeah, if it's more about you than it is about like the issue, that's probably a good sign. Like you need to do work. Okay. If you're like, I shouldn't be angry about this, but I am. Yeah. That's probably a time when you're like, why am I angry about that? I need to do some processing and internal work. But if you're like, no, this is just a thing that consistently comes up that should be dealt with, then deal with it.
Or an escalated anger response is something that's, a 2 or 3 on the anger scale. Yeah. That's normal, but something that brings you to an 8. It's like, what is it? Why is this bringing me?
Yeah. What else is happening in my life right now that I have this type of feeling?
Yeah.
Because that's the thing. The thing with healthy conflict is there's a continuum. And it's just basically on one end of the conflict spectrum is like, basically divide in half. So you have one half, the other half. Okay. One half is like constructive conflict. Okay. It's building up. The other half is destructive conflict, tearing down. Okay. And that can go from like saying saying a kind of mean thing that's like, I can kind of brush that off, to like straight up saying you are a terrible person for thinking this way. Like that's a lot of room in there. Okay. And similarly on the constructive side, if you actually go to the far extreme of like the constructive side, it's actually like you're so caring about not having like being constructive that you actually don't have the conflict. And it's like the term that's used is artificial harmony, where it's like I'm acting like everything is okay, even though it's not.
What was that in a Radical Candor you were talking about?
Yeah, Radical Candor has a similar thing that they talk about called ruinous empathy.
Ruinous empathy.
But so either artificial harmony, ruinous empathy, but the idea with either of those things is there an issue that you should be dealing with that will make the other person or the relationship or the situation better, but you're unwilling to because you don't want to deal with the discomfort of conflict?
So that's just avoiding. So is it still on the scale? Because I feel like it's just avoiding conflict at that point. You're just, because a constructive.
Yeah, and that's where it's like almost, it's like you're moving far and farther away from conflict.
Yeah, okay.
Like as far as in that sense goes. Okay. And that's where it's like kind of combining two concepts from two different books a little bit. Yeah. In that where it's like, it's more the ruinous empathy side, which is like, do you care about somebody enough to talk about hard things? Because like if somebody is ruining their life, they're making decisions that are like setting them down a path. Like you think of like a lot of families talk about like their teenage kids, where it's like, oh, you are getting addicted to drugs and you want to go party and you want to do these things. Like these things are going to hurt you. Yeah. It's like, are you willing to have the hard conversation of saying like, hey, I care about you enough that like this is going to like damage you for in your future. It's going to cause issues that like will affect you for the rest of your life.
That's interesting.
Okay. And it's like, because the truly caring thing to do in that situation is to say something and is to like enter into that conflict. If you were to like have somebody that is doing something you know is going to hurt them and you don't say anything, that's actually like harmful to them. If you're like, I know this is going to hurt you, but I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to deal with the discomfort of bringing it up.
Yeah, I'd say the thing that comes to mind is somebody at work not doing well, or just someone who's just not caring and they're earning a paycheck. That's not going to help them in the long run. They're only going to get bad references. People are going to talk, poorly when seeking references, seeking job applications. So
yeah, and the key is to do it in a gentle and like encouraging way.
Right.
To be like, hey, you are not meeting the potential that I know you have.
Yeah.
And can I share something with you? Like, I think you're missing something that is going to help you in the long run if you figure this out.
Yeah.
And figuring out what is it for each person that might be slightly different of like what encourages them. But it's like not doing it from a spot. You need to shape up.
Yeah.
But it's doing it in a way that's like, hey, like I care about you and I want you to do well. And this is an area where it's like, if this doesn't change, this is going to cause problems for that.
Yeah. I can see that.
That's especially important for like, if you're in a leadership position, with like anybody, where it's like, if you see somebody underperforming to the point where it's like, if they keep doing that, I'm probably gonna have to fire them.
Right.
You should say something sooner.
Them. Yeah.
Well, for two reasons. One, you may be able to say something like, oh, that's not something that I think I can improve in. And it's like, okay, well, let's help you find something that you can do better.
Yeah.
But you're not shocking them. Or it's like you let them know and they work on it and they don't grow. And then you talk about it more and they work on it and they don't grow. Then when you do have to, it's like, hey, this isn't working out. They're like, I know.
Yeah.
They might still not be happy about it, but they're not like, nobody should ever be surprised when they get fired for underperforming.
Right.
They should have plenty of opportunity to show like, hey, this is where you're like underperforming and we want you to be here. We want you to excel, but this is like where you need to get better and you need to work on this and you need to work on this. And it's like, if you have those conversations enough where it's like, hey, this hasn't gotten better and we've given metrics, we've given goals and it just hasn't happened. And even if they're not happy about it, if you've done the due diligence of communicating well, it's like if you're in a leadership position having to fire somebody, there's an element where it's like, yeah, I know I'm not shaping up. Yeah. And this sucks, but I know.
been dreading this day. Yeah. Kind of expect it.
But yeah, and so that's the hard part where it's like it'd be much easier from a comfort standpoint to just be like, I'm not gonna say anything. But then when you do eventually fire them, like one of the stories in the book Radical Candor that the author talks about is this guy who's just underperforming consistently. And then eventually she needed to fires him in that, basically the exit interview conversation. He's like, why didn't you tell me?
Why didn't you tell me sooner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like,
yeah.
And she's like, oh, and it just like hit in a hard, heavy way.
Because if you tell them sooner in the right way, you got to deliver it. Even if you deliver it poorly, it's better to have the issue brought up better than having fire.
Yeah. Well, and that's where it's like, I wouldn't say don't enter into conflict unless you are feeling calm and like doing this. Like there are some times where it's like you have to do it even when you have energy. But I would say everybody should have a goal of this is where trust comes back. You should have the goal of having the best for that person and like getting the best outcome for them.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you just don't like somebody as a person, like I'd almost say don't enter into conflict with that person unless you're in like a position of leadership, and then you need to work on your heart.
Yeah. Okay.
Like you need to work on your heart. But if you have energy around something and you just like, this is urgent, we need to talk about it right now. It's better to talk about it and maybe cross the line, but then be able to apologize if you have that trust than to not say anything at all and then have it break.
Yeah. I think my problem is with conflict is like, oh, I don't want to do it the wrong way. So I just try to avoid it. But I think you need to have the conflict.
Well, like anything, you get better by practicing.
Right. Yeah.
And
that's true.
And you're like, that sucks.
Yeah.
But it's like, and with anything,
better to fail
you get better at having hard conversations by having more hard conversations.
That makes sense.
And it's like, you figure out what works and what doesn't work, and you learn from it, and then you apologize when you mess up.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing with trust too, is like we talked about that line as far as like constructive, destructive. The best point for conflict is right on the inside edge of that constructive line, where it's like
almost destructive.
So it's like right up to the edge where it's the highest tension.
Okay.
Because like muscles grow under tension. Like things grow from hard situations. Like we talk about resilience, like when we talk about like how do you grow resilience, it's like being put under pressure.
Yeah. And you're getting the point out, you're getting the issue. Here's the problem set.
And so if you're living close to that line, getting stuff done, being super effective and super like efficient in your conflict,
Yeah.
We're human, and you're going to step over it occasionally.
Yeah.
And it's going to happen. And that's where trust comes back in, of them knowing that you have their best in mind, and like vice versa. So they're trusting you to be like, I'm not going to immediately assume the worst. I'm going to assume the best. And then you also being vulnerable and apologizing. And it goes both sides of that, where it's like when you have that trust, like you don't want to live on the other side of the line, but if you occasionally step over, it's a different situation than somebody that you're like, well, I knew you hated me.
Right.
Like as far as I knew you didn't like me and didn't want, like you wanted me out.
Apologize. Humbly apologize. Don't just say, sorry for doing this.
Yeah.
And
like
take
genuine,
time to
be
apologize.
genuine.
Yeah. Meaningfully. That's good.
Yeah. So conflict can be healthy. And I think the hard part is a lot of people is just, they haven't experienced healthy conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, trust is the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Having the best for them in mind, and like trusting that they have the best for you in mind,
Mm-hmm.
being vulnerable, apologizing, getting to know them. But what are some like actual, like the next step is like, how do you enter into like this conflict?
Yeah. So how do I enter the conflict?
Yeah. It's like, how do you like do this more?
Yeah.
In a good way.
I'd say with close trusted individuals,
Yeah.
you can maybe even pull I think we were talking about like pulling it out of them.
Yeah.
Like if you see someone you're close with and they're just not in a good mood, you can say, hey, what's on your mind?
Yeah.
What are you thinking about? And if you kind of know that there's something that you did that, you don't know what, you say, hey, what's going on?
Like we talked about it earlier a little bit, and it's like my wife and I, there are times when we know it's just we're disconnected, we're off.
Something's not right.
And it's like,
don't know what.
There's tension, and either one of us at different times, probably me more often than her, but it's like she does it to me too. It's like what's on your mind?
Yeah.
What you thinking?
Yeah. What is it?
Yeah,
that's what.
Yeah, it's like you guys say, what is it? And it's just that, and it's in those moments, it's that feeling of, I don't want to do this, but I need to.
Yeah. It's kind of, it opens the door, and the person who's going through that has that decision to go through it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Like they can open the door, they can go through the doorway, I guess.
Yeah.
You've opened the door.
And I've had times in our relationship where my wife has said, I don't want to talk about it yet.
Yeah.
Thankfully though, and part of it is because like early on we like made like commitments to each other. It's like we're always going to work through stuff. Like we're never going to let things just sit forever.
Mm-hmm.
But I've learned that some people need time to process things,
Mm-hmm.
and some people need less. I'm much more like, let's talk through it. I'm a bit more of a verbal processor. Let's just get through it. Get through it right now.
Yep.
And she's like, let me go think about it for like 2 or 3 hours.
Yeah.
And then I'll come back and think and talk to you.
Yeah.
And I've had to learn, okay, I just need to let it rest, and then we'll figure it out. Like she needs processing time, and then we will still connect and be and reconcile, because that's like where it's like that trust comes back in. As far as when you ask that question, you have to do it with the intent of, we want to be like unified again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It cannot be I need to win the argument.
Right.
It's, I want to be on the same page. I want to be connected. I want to be together. I want to be unified.
That's good.
Yeah. And so that's like the intimate, personal, like spouse relationship. I would say that applies to close friends as well. When you get into more broad context, there's an idea of mining for conflict, kind of asking that question of like, say you're on a team at work, trying to get something done, and you can do that same thing in that context. And it's like, still like the goal is like whatever the end goal of the project is, or centering on that, keeping that in front. But you can ask questions like, hey, you haven't said anything this whole time. What do you think?
Yeah. What are your thoughts on this?
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah.
You can even sometimes say, if you're in the leadership position, especially, you can kind of set expectations beforehand of being like, hey, I want everybody's input. And I'm going to assume that if you don't say anything, that you disagree.
Okay.
And you can be like, and so either need you to say that you agree, and why, or explain why you disagree.
Yeah.
And like trusting that we're for each other. We all want the same end result. We want it to succeed.
Yeah.
But like, you can put that out there. You can say that. And like I'm trying to think if I've ever done that with my wife or in a more personal situation. I think I have, but not in the same, like quite as like blunt way, as far as like, if you're silent, I disagree. But I have said, hey, like, let's talk about this, and we need to actually, like, I want to hear your opinion. Like, I want to hear what you really think about this. And versus just being like, hey, like, what do you think? It's like, I really want to hear, like, I even did this in a very minor way with a volunteer recently where I know he's trying to follow a specific diet, but I'm like, he still needs to eat. And it's like, and he's like refused me buying him lunch every time I've offered. And I was like, hey, this is something I do every time. And I want to do this for you. What is a place that I can get you? And it's like, it wasn't conflict in the traditional sense, but it was a strategic, like, I'm going to like say this in a way where you have to give an answer that has substance and not just I'm good.
It's like, hey, do you want me to buy your lunch? And you're like, no, I'm good. Hey, do you want some lunch? Yeah. Versus like, hey, I want to get you lunch. What would you rather have? Okay. It's phrasing the question.
And so that's like that's not conflict per se, but that principle of phrasing things and asking questions in a way that like encourages people to respond with substance.
That's good.
Is a good skill to have in general, but especially in conflict.
And keeping that higher purpose of like, here's the issue I'm trying to resolve, not just win an argument. Because if that is the case, you maybe check yourself, but check yourself before you have that conflict. What's the higher purpose? What's the goal I want to get to?
Yeah. And kind of the last thing I'll say is this applies in the moment, especially in like business contexts, but it applies more probably after the moment in personal context, is recognizing and actually saying, hey, like, this is good that we had this conflict.
Yeah.
Like, it's good that we did this.
Say, this is okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that my wife and I, like, I'm so thankful for this because, like, when we have conflict, almost every time we've been able to resolve it within, like, the day.
Nice.
Like, as far as there have been very few times where it's like it's lasted more than a day where we're not on the same page. And again, I would say actually probably every time, if not like 99.9% of the time, we feel like connected and closer after getting through it. Where we aren't we like actually put everything on the table. We actually worked through it. We had the conversation that was hard, but we felt like closer because of it. And so it's like we can say with honesty, hey, this was good.
That's good.
Even if it was hard, it was good.
Yeah, that's good.
And yeah, because there's people that want to live the well-prepared life, and we want to like nurture this growth and embrace responsibility. We do the hard thing, we do the hard good thing over the easy like fine thing.
Yeah, and I would argue if you're practicing in the easy times of having hard conversations, if something bigger happens, it'll be better to have had some practice of how to navigate conflict. Healthily, versus a big blow up fight and then I don't know what to do. I've never had conflict before, so yeah.
Healthy conflict is good, and I think we briefly addressed it, but I do want to say this: if you start attacking the person, that's unhealthy conflict.
You're right.
It's like conflict is about the issue, not the person, and so remember that as you're like, if you're in a spot of like, well, you just never, it's like pause, hold up, like that's a foul in that sense. It's hey, this happened and this keeps happening this way, and I really think it needs to change. Or I really think we need to think about this a different way. It's about the issue, not the person. And even in matters of character issues, just talking about these things keep happening and I'm noticing a trend. Why do you think that's happening? And like, people will only change character internally. You can't change somebody's character. Like, you can't change somebody.
Yeah.
Like, you can't work out for your wife.
Right.
You can't, like, my wife can't cause me to eat healthier.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Like, she can't change me. She can bring up the issues and the things she notices, but it's up to me to make the change.
Yeah.
And so because of that, it's unhelpful to like basically disparage my character or to like attack me as a person, because it's more likely to cause me to like turn off and not address it. Versus being like, hey, I noticed these things happening. Why do you think that is? Like, this is kind of hard.
Yeah.
And being able to like bring those up in an honest and like kind way.
Yeah.
Bam.
That's good.
So enter into conflict. Choose to do it. When you have that gut feeling of, I really should say something, lean in. Because that's how you do the hard thing. That's how you forge resilience, is you lean into the hard things.
Build the trust with the close people around you up front before the conflict happens. So that way it's easier to have the conflict.
Yeah. So start building trust, have conflict, work through hard things.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all we got. Thank you for joining us on the Journey to Well-Prepared Life. Share this with a friend. Get it out there. I've noticed right now we're still pretty low on the listeners. So if you're listening to this later, hopefully this has gone up. We have like 4 listens per podcast. We got like
Nice.
4 faithful people that
All right.
are listening. And so thank you for listening. And we will keep trying to share this out, like as far as we need to talk to people too. But thanks for listening. If you're one of those 4 especially.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah. We'll talk to you later.